Hello everyone and welcome back! After introducing the best practices for handling session cookies, let's see where we are at the level of our application. So if we hit sign up for a new user, notice here the top menu. If we hit sign up, we are going to create the new user on the database, securely store the password, assign a session ID, and save it in a cookie. So now the next request that we are doing here will also include this new cookie. But there is a problem here. As you noticed, the behavior of the application has changed as the user has been authenticated, as a session is available. So after sign up, we have propagated the user information to the rest of the application, and the top menu has hidden both the sign up and the login buttons and has shown the logout button. So now, if we would refresh this session, what we're going to see is that these buttons are back again. So we did receive the session ID back from the server, but the authentication service, which contains the user data, is not aware of that cookie. It does not have the user data, so it will propagate to the rest of the application that the application is under an anonymous user. So what we need to do here is we need, at application startup time, when this service is initialized, we want to do a request to the server to fetch the user data in case the user is already authenticated, meaning that a session ID exists. Only if the session ID is not a valid session ID, then we should show the default look and feel, meaning that we are showing these two buttons. If the user is already authenticated, the application should be adapted accordingly. Another thing that we're going to do is to protect the lessons data, meaning that it should only be visible to authenticated users. Right now, let's take care first of loading the user data. We're going to do that here at the level of the constructor. We are going to take the HTTP client and we are going to do a GET call to the server. We're going to apply the /API prefix and we're going to be calling a new service that is not yet implemented. It's going to be the user service. We are going to subscribe to this service and we are going to assume that this service here is going to return us the user data. So we are going to add here the generic parameter that defines what is the response of this HTTP request. Once we receive the user here at the level of the success handler, we are going to propagate this user information to the rest of the application. But we are going to do so only if we actually received some data from the backend. Because if the user is not yet authenticated, then we will not have here any user data. So if the user data is available, we are going to broadcast it to the rest of the application using the internal subject. But if there is no user data, then we are going to broadcast to the rest of the application the anonymous user. So now that we have the client part for this logic implemented, let's implement the server part. We're going to create here a new express route. Let's then create a file. We are going to call it getUserRoute. So this file will contain an express route. Inside this file, we are going to start by defining the skeleton of this route handler. So we are going to define here the getUserRoute definition function. We are going to pass in a request and a response. And before going any further, we are going to plug in the definition of this route here at the level of the REST API definition. We're going to define here a new route. So as we have seen, it's going to be the /API/user route. We are going to be receiving a GET request and we're going to handle it using the getUser function that we're going to import from the new file that we just created. And with this in place, let's then implement the getUser function. The first thing that we're going to do is we are going to retrieve the session ID from the HTTP request. And we can do so in the following way. We are going to go to the request and we are going to access the cookies map or the cookies object. This object is being populated by this middleware here, the cookie parser middleware. Now we are going to access it and we're going to retrieve specifically the session ID cookie. Now that we have the session ID, we need to go to the session store and we need to somehow from the store retrieve the user that corresponds to this session ID. We are going to need a new method for that it's not defined yet. We are going to call it find user by session ID. And we are going to pass to this method one argument, which will be the session ID. Let's then implement the method. Here is what the method would look like. We're going to add it here to the session store class. We're going to add it an argument, the session ID. Having the session ID, the first thing that we are going to try to do is to retrieve the associated session. So this might or might not be a valid session ID. Let's try to retrieve the session ID from the sessions map. And we're going to define here a constant. We are going to see, is this a valid session? So we are going to see, does the session exist? And if so, is the session valid? We're going to first check for the truthiness of the session, and then we are going to call the isValid operator on it. And with this in place, we have everything necessary for returning the user data if it's available. So we're going to start by checking, is the session valid? If it's valid, we are going to return the user data of the session. But if it's invalid, we are going to return undefined instead. So with this in place, we now have here available the user data or undefined. Actually, we can define here a union type to make sure that this is expressed in the type system. We are going to take the user data, and if the user data exists, we are going to send back the response directly. So we know that we need to send a status code of 200, meaning that the request was processed successfully. We are going to send here as JSON, we are going to send the user data. But what would happen in the case that the user is undefined, meaning that either the session ID is an invalid session ID, for example, an attacker tried to simulate a session ID and it's not a valid session, or the session is a valid session, but it has meanwhile expired. So in that case, we are going to send back to the client, we are going to send a response with an empty body, and we are going to send the status code 204. 204 means no content. It means that the request was successfully processed, but the server did not find any content to send back to the client. So let's reload the server and try this new version out. So we are going to be creating here a new user. Let's see what happens when we click sign up, and let's keep an eye here on the top menu. We're going to click sign up. So again, the logout button is shown. The lessons data is still available, but now let's see what happens if we hit refresh. Let's keep an eye on the header. So as you see, the final result is correct. We have here the logout button correctly displayed, but there was some sort of flickering effect here where some buttons were initially shown and then the final result appeared. So this is not good for user experience. Let's see how can we fix this problem so that we only see the final result. Let's first understand the cause for this flickering effect. So if we go back here to the authentication service, we're going to see that the first value emitted by the subject is going to be the anonymous user. Then the HTTP request is going to be made, and depending on the result of the request, we are going to emit the user data. So what we would like to do is that this initial value here is not actually the anonymous user. The initial value should be considered undefined. Initially, when this authentication service is created, we don't know yet if the user is authenticated or not at this point in the program. So we're going to define the initial value of the behavior subject as being undefined, and we want to make sure that this value is not emitted, is not broadcasted to the rest of the application. So here in our observable definition, we're going to add here the filter operator, and we are going to filter out this value. So we have here the user. We are going to make sure that we only broadcast user values if the user is defined. So if we now hit Ctrl S, the application is going to be reloaded, and this filter function here will effectively filter out the undefined value. Let's have a look at it. We are going to reload the server, so as you can see, immediately we get the logout button displayed. We no longer have that flickering effect. So the application is now aware of the user session and it's adapting the UI accordingly. Let's now then start securing the data of our application. Let's take, for example, the lessons data and make sure that it's displayed only to authenticated users. Let's see how can we protect this data. This is coming right up in the next few lessons.